These are kind of an extension of works I've been making for 10, 15 years, which I've kind of broken down thinking about material. I've made several works this scale out of wood, but never out of metal. A lot of the times the wood ones act as maquettes for the metal ones. Thinking about this show, what happens if I do make something at a smaller scale out of a material that usually used outdoors, something that can sustain the elements. What I found interesting is what happens when you take something that's usually a larger scale and sort of shrink it, but keep the thickness of the material. It starts to become almost an exaggeration. The word caricature or cartoon comes to mind, It kind of exaggerates even the curves when something is kind of made smaller, I thought. They usually start with a sketch in the sketchbook I draw all the time. And from there, once I see something that looks interesting, I'll start to cut it out of, it's this material called ram board. A lot of construction workers put it down when they're working on a house, to protect the floor. And it's not cardboard and it's not paper, but it's this really kind of thick paper. I can cut it up and bend it and kind of manipulate it in my hand. And I like that because I like to be able to manipulate things fast. Most of my practice comes out of like a collage history, I guess, or a way of working, I guess would be more accurate. With this kind of material, I can cut it, put things together, see if it stands up as a sculpture, and they're usually about like this big. And from there, I've been working with this fabricator who can take that, scan it, and then make a three-dimensional model for me in the computer. I'm able to then draw back into it, so then the sketching happens again. Looking at this pink one in the back, you can see there's this sort of curly cue up there. So for me, that's a drawing of the blue shape that's hanging. So that's one end of it, and then the volume is the end form. It's fun to kind of play with all that in between that happens. When I give it to the fabricator, I tell them, don't round anything. It has to be an exact replica of that smaller form. I did think about maybe a relationship to painting because they're at this height that you view on the wall, like a painting, which I thought was interesting for sculpture because you walk up to it, you just don't look at it that way. Maybe some of them indicate a front by having Aaron Curry here. And you think, oh, that's the front of it, but you walk around it and it sort of becomes then this experience. I was interested in using matte colors with this, which really abstracted the sense of the material so that by getting rid of a gloss or a sheen, they almost can feel like rubber or something, It's like just make you question, well, what is that? Is it a soft material, hard material? This idea goes back to the animation cell, I think, which I like that a lot of the backgrounds, even thinking of Looney Tunes, Chuck Jones and stuff, they're watercolored backgrounds that have a softness to them. And then the cell has a strong outline around it. They still exist in that same space together, but they're from different places. It is something that I thought about when making these, but to think about it and then actually have it happen is two different things. I've been talking about this for years, is trying to get my sculptures into this awkward space where they're two-dimensional, but also three-dimensional. A lot of those artists like Calder, Noguchi, David Smith, Picasso, Miro, this all comes from that language. They invented it. I know that people have talked about like, oh, is there a humor or making fun of, or is there some kind of thing? But I don't think about it in those terms. Some people will take whatever, they can take this light and say that's sculpture, and then you'd be like, oh, that's a lineage of Duchamp. I like that people know the language. It's kind of like jazz or something. Miles Davis didn't invent jazz, but he took it and tried to do something with it. And that's kind of how I think about this. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel every time. Maybe because I came out of a music background as a kid, I think about art in those terms. Because I was reading a bit of Kandinsky and Joseph Alber's ideas of abstraction, and back to music and this idea that music isn't something that you necessarily say, well, what's that about? Maybe you do now with like pop lyrics, but if you think about Beethoven or something, it's more about like you spend this certain amount of time experiencing the thing. And I think that that's interesting when thinking about sculpture, the time you spend walking around it and your physical relationship to it. One thing I realized when I first started making sculpture, it's hard to make something completely abstract because we have such a relationship with things in the world. I think because normally as humans, our interaction with things that use this material is like a car, patio furniture, a kid's playground or something, and we just think of those are functional things, right? They should be painted this way, a certain way. They're very refined things, and I think that's okay. Sometimes if I think it's interesting, I can lean into that more, like, okay, what happens if I let this subject matter enter the work a little bit? I like to think of my work as collage-based because it gives me a certain freedom. I think of collage that you can keep all this sort of material around for years, and then finally two things can come together. They still carry whatever that reference is that they're sending off individually, but you put them together, they create something new. This one's interesting because this one was actually developed a lot more as a sketch than the ones inside even. I didn't even start with a cardboard maquette. I took drawings and then had them rendered into a digital space and then worked off of that. And I think maybe that working so much in kind of a digital sketching mode where it exists in this virtual space. Maybe it's just something the way that it's carried over through the way that it's drawn in that. But while doing that, the way it's developed is through kind of a quick sketch, which maybe it brings up this idea of a primitive line where it's not something that's very meticulously drawn out and slowly or something. I want to capture that speed of the sketch, which kind of lends itself to this idea of the primitive. It's interesting to think then whatever the futurist part of that would be the refinement maybe of the material or freezing that gesture into a solid metal and then painting it this pink. Starting with the line from a sketchbook, something flat on paper, putting that line into a space, digital space, it gives it volume or, more material. It's not just ink on a paper, it becomes an inch. I can make 2 inches. I think there's 2.5 inches of material. It's still a line. It also becomes a sculptural line in space. Thinking about the digital Photoshop or whatever program you use to draw on a pad, it cleans up your line. It automatically rounds the edge. But at the same time, I think that's interesting. It's almost like a pinstriping brush. They really have this triangular shape so that you can make them flatten out and then get to a very tight point so that it has these parameters. And I think the digital line has that same sort of thing. So I kind of embrace that. I grew up in the 70s BMX racing, and there was 2 bike companies in particular, which I had one of them, which was SE Racing. They had these beautiful welds that sort of standed out to me on that bike compared to all these other bikes. It was like, oh, here's something that's functional that we have to put to hold these pieces of tubing together. Why not make a beautiful weld, whatever that is, or why not just acknowledge that it's something that can be aesthetic? So that's something I've actually borrowed with mine, thinking about the weld as not just something that is functional, but I like to sort of think of the weld as another way of mark making, because if it has to be there in some instances, why not use it as another way to make a line or a gesture? Once I started making these smaller sculptures, it was like, should I make a smaller weld now? Because you can. But I ended up saying, what happens if I use the same size weld that I'm using on the outdoor larger sculptures? And we get back to this kind of like exaggeration. The rivets, I could have made smaller rivets that would have just scaling the whole thing down. But by keeping some of the aspects of the sculpture on the scale of the larger sculptures, I was thinking of it as like puffing something up with air, like a balloon or something, it just like fattens it up. At first I was cutting out the sculptures out of wood to the actual scale of the sculpture. So I would have made a wood sculpture that was exactly this height and then been trace this out of metal. What happened was I found that it kind of lost a little bit of the life, and I was like, well, what is the life of this thing, right? And what I found was that gesture, that mark, that scribble, it somehow indicates speed and time in your head, like it registers that way. And I felt like I wanted my sculptures to not feel completely closed down. I had to find a way that the sculpture still had that kind of life, which was like something to do with tactile experience and also the idea or the speed of a line. I wouldn't let things get too cleaned up too fast. I wouldn't labor over certain cuts or certain drawings in the sculptures. When they are finally fabricated into this scale, they still retain that sense of life.
you.